He spat at another nanny, and the only sound in the $30 million mansion was the quiet scratch of a pen signing her final paycheck. Richard Bennett didn't look up from his glass desk as the house manager cleared her throat and said softly, "That makes 5 this month. 5 trained professionals, 5 background checks, 5 resumes stacked with glowing references. None of them lasted more than 72 hours with 8-year-old Lucas Bennett." The marble foyer stretched nearly 40 feet from door to staircase, polished so perfectly it reflected the crystal chandelier above like a second sky. But the house felt colder than the January wind sweeping across the Hudson outside. Lucas stood near the base of the staircase, small shoulders tight, fists balled at his sides, defiance masking something deeper, something no therapist had managed to reach. He hadn't always been this way. Before the accident, before the silence that swallowed the house whole, he used to run these hallways in socked feet, laughter echoing off stone and glass. Now his voice was a rare thing, and when it appeared, it came sharp and sudden. "He needs firmer boundaries," one specialist had suggested. "He needs consistency," said another. Richard believed in structure. He believed in schedules measured to the minute, in tutors paid by the hour, in solutions that could be negotiated and solved. What he did not believe in was weakness. So when Naomi Carter arrived that morning through the staff entrance, wearing a simple gray uniform and carrying nothing but a canvas tote, no one expected her to last until sunset. She wasn't hired as a nanny. She was housekeeping, temporary, quiet, a black woman in her early 30s who kept her eyes steady and her answers short. She'd taken the job because it paid $22 an hour and came with overtime. She'd taken it because grief had a way of making silence feel safer than conversation. The house manager gave her a quick warning in the corridor lined with framed oil paintings worth more than most homes in Connecticut. "Don't take it personally," she said. Naomi nodded once. She understood more than the woman realized. By noon, Lucas had already knocked over a tray of juice glasses in the breakfast room, the crash echoing against 12-foot ceilings. Staff froze. Richard's jaw tightened. And then Lucas turned toward Naomi, eyes flashing with something fierce and unspoken, and spat at her the way he had done to every nanny before. The room stopped breathing. One of the assistants stepped forward, ready to intervene. Richard pushed back his chair slowly, expecting another resignation before dinner. But Naomi did not wipe her cheek in anger. She did not raise her voice. She did not call him rude or threaten consequences. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, as if the expensive walls and the tension and the watching eyes had disappeared. Then she lowered herself to the marble floor, bringing her gaze level with his, and said quietly, "You don't have to push everyone away." And for the first time in weeks, Lucas didn't move. Lucas did not step back, but he did not spit again either. The air inside the breakfast room felt heavier than the winter clouds pressing against the tall windows. Naomi stayed where she was on the marble floor, knees resting against the cold stone, hands open and visible, her voice steady enough to carry but soft enough not to challenge him. Richard remained near the long oak table, his expression unreadable, waiting for the outburst that usually followed silence. It did not come. Lucas stared at her as if trying to decide whether she was real. Most adults reacted quickly to him. They corrected him, restrained him, redirected him, spoke in tight professional tones. Naomi did none of that. She did not move closer. She did not retreat. She simply existed at his level, as if the 40-foot ceilings and the staff lined along the walls did not matter. "You are not in trouble," she said after a few seconds. The words were plain. No lecture, no discipline, no threat. The house manager shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to interrupt. Richard folded his arms across his chest, watching the exchange like a negotiation he had not approved. Lucas's jaw tightened. His small hands trembled once, then stilled. The anger on his face flickered, replaced for a brief moment by something far younger. Naomi noticed the way his shoulders lifted with each breath, too fast, too shallow. She had seen that rhythm before. She had held it in her own arms years ago. "It feels loud inside, does it not?" she continued quietly. A clock ticked somewhere down the hall. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the iron gates, tires crunching on gravel nearly a quarter-mile away. Lucas blinked, confused by the question. No one had ever asked him what it felt like. They had only told him how he was behaving. Richard took a step forward. "That is enough," he began. But Naomi lifted one hand gently without looking back. Just 1 minute, she said, not defiant, simply certain. Lucas's breathing slowed by a fraction. His gaze dropped to the floor between them. A long silence stretched, thin but unbroken. Then, unexpectedly, he moved. Not away, not toward the staircase. He lowered himself onto the marble across from her, mirroring her posture, knees bent, palms flat against the stone. The staff exchanged glances. Richard did not speak. Naomi matched his breathing, slow and measured, as if teaching without announcing a lesson. You can be angry, she told him, but you do not have to be alone with it. Lucas swallowed hard. His face tightened, then softened again. For the first time in weeks, he did not look like a problem to be solved. He looked like a child who had been waiting for someone to stop walking away. Richard Bennett had built his empire on certainty, on the belief that every problem had a measurable solution. Yet as he stood in his own breakfast room, watching his 8-year-old son sit quietly across from a woman who had been hired to clean baseboards, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It was not anger. It was not control. It was the uncomfortable awareness that he did not understand what was happening in his own home. The staff along the walls slowly stepped back, sensing the shift. Naomi remained seated on the marble floor, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, her presence unforced. Lucas mirrored her without being asked. His small sneakers rested flat against the stone, his palms spread beside his knees, eyes fixed somewhere between them. Minutes passed without a single command, without a single correction. The chandelier above them cast a soft reflection across the polished floor, turning the space into something almost sacred. Richard cleared his throat, intending to restore order, but the sound felt too loud, too sharp against the fragile quiet that had formed. Lucas glanced up at him, not with defiance this time, but with uncertainty. Naomi noticed the glance and spoke before the moment could fracture. You do not have to choose sides, she said gently, her voice directed toward the boy but carrying to the father. Richard stiffened at the implication, yet he did not interrupt. Lucas swallowed and pressed his lips together, fighting something invisible. His fingers curled slightly, then relaxed again. The house, which once echoed with raised voices and hurried footsteps, now held only the sound of measured breathing. Naomi tilted her head just slightly. When it feels loud inside, she continued, sometimes it helps to let someone sit with you. She did not reach for him. She did not invade the small circle of space he had created. She simply waited. Waiting was something Richard rarely did. Deals were closed in minutes. Decisions were executed in hours. But this was different. This required stillness, and stillness had always felt like weakness to him. Lucas's eyes filled, not with tears, but with the weight of words he had not spoken in months. His shoulders shook once, then steadied. Slowly, hesitantly, he shifted forward by a single inch. Then another. The movement was so small that most of the staff would have missed it, but Richard saw it clearly. It was the first voluntary step his son had taken toward anyone in weeks. Naomi did not celebrate the movement. She did not smile triumphantly. She kept her gaze soft, inviting but never demanding. Lucas leaned closer until the space between them narrowed to less than a foot. He studied her face as if searching for proof that she would react the way others had. She did not. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt warmer, less brittle. Richard felt his certainty cracking, not in humiliation, but in realization. Control had not brought his son back. Authority had not reached him. Yet here, on a cold marble floor inside a mansion that measured success in square footage and stock value, connection was beginning to do what power never could. Lucas was close enough now that Naomi could see the faint freckles across his nose, close enough that the tension in his jaw was no longer defiance, but fear of what might happen next. The marble beneath them felt less like a cold surface and more like neutral ground, a place where neither authority nor anger held power. Richard remained standing near the table, his tailored jacket still crisp, his posture rigid, yet something inside him was shifting inch by inch. He had always believed that respect came from strength, that obedience followed command, but what he was witnessing did not resemble either. Lucas lifted his hand slowly, hesitantly, as if testing invisible air. The movement was fragile, uncertain. Naomi did not move toward him. She kept her hands resting loosely on her knees, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing calm and steady, offering no reaction that could startle him away. The staff watched from the edges of the room, unsure whether to intervene or retreat further. Sunlight broke briefly through the gray afternoon clouds, casting a pale stripe across the polished floor that reached the space between them like a quiet invitation. Lucas's fingers hovered near her sleeve, not touching, not withdrawing. He glanced once toward his father, perhaps expecting interruption, perhaps expecting correction. Richard did not speak. For the first time in months, he chose stillness over control. Naomi spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not have to be brave all the time." The words seemed to settle into the air rather than strike it. Lucas's lips trembled, not with anger, but with effort. He lowered his hand halfway, then paused. The silence deepened, stretching across the wide breakfast room and into the hallway beyond. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed gently as a housekeeper stepped away to give them privacy. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving Lucas's. "It is okay to miss someone," she added carefully, knowing without being told that grief lived here, that absence echoed in every polished corner of the mansion. Richard inhaled sharply at the edge of the room, the truth of those words landing harder than any accusation. Lucas's hand finally made contact, small fingers brushing against the fabric of Naomi's sleeve, as if confirming she was real. The touch lasted only a second before he pulled back, startled by his own vulnerability. Naomi did not comment. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the courage it took to reach out. Lucas shifted forward again, this time closing the remaining space between them until their knees nearly touched. His breathing, once quick and shallow, began to slow into rhythm with hers. Richard felt the weight of realization pressing against him. His son had not needed stricter rules or another specialist flown in from across the country. He had needed someone who did not flinch, someone who did not walk away. And as Lucas leaned forward just slightly more, resting his forehead gently against Naomi's shoulder without a word, the mansion that had felt hollow for months held its breath in reverent silence. Lucas remained there for several seconds, his forehead resting lightly against Naomi's shoulder, as if testing whether comfort would disappear the moment he allowed himself to feel it. Naomi did not wrap her arms around him immediately. She understood the difference between holding and trapping. She kept her posture open, her breathing slow, letting him decide how close was safe. The marble floor beneath them had lost its chill, or perhaps the warmth in the room had finally begun to rise. Richard watched from only a few feet away, yet he felt miles from the quiet exchange unfolding in front of him. He had spent nearly a year trying to rebuild order after loss tore through their lives like a storm. He had replaced routines, expanded security, scheduled consultations that stretched across state lines. None of it had reached his son. And now, in the span of minutes, something invisible had shifted without force or instruction. Lucas lifted his head slightly, eyes uncertain but no longer guarded. His hand, small and tentative, reached up once more. This time he did not stop at her sleeve. His fingers brushed her cheek, hesitant, as if asking permission without words. Naomi did not speak. She did not smile too quickly. She simply held his gaze steady, allowing him the space to choose. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Every professional had warned him that Lucas resisted physical connection, that contact triggered agitation. Yet here he was, leaning closer of his own will. The room felt suspended in time. The house manager had quietly dismissed the remaining staff, leaving only the three of them in the wide breakfast room. Outside, the winter sky had begun to clear, thin sunlight spilling across the long windows in bands of pale gold. Lucas studied Naomi's face for another heartbeat. Then slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss against her cheek. It was brief, almost shy, but it was unmistakable. Not defiance, not testing, trust. The simple gesture seemed louder than any outburst that had filled the house before. Richard felt something break open inside his chest, not in pain, but in recognition. His son was not unreachable. He was not cruel. He was grieving in a language no one had taken the time to learn. Naomi closed her eyes for only a second, honoring the courage of the moment, then opened them again, calm and grounded. Lucas did not pull away immediately. He remained close, his small hand still resting near her face, breathing steady now, almost peaceful. The mansion that had once echoed with tension felt different, as if the air itself had softened. Richard lowered himself slowly into one of the dining chairs, his usual authority replaced by quiet humility. For the first time since his wife's passing, he understood that strength was not measured by control. It was measured by who was willing to stay when it would be easier to walk away. Lucas stayed close for a long moment after the kiss, as if unsure whether the world would shift again now that he had crossed that invisible line. Naomi did not rush to stand. She remained seated on the marble floor, letting the quiet settle naturally, allowing the moment to breathe instead of turning it into something dramatic. The late afternoon light stretched longer across the breakfast room, warming the pale stone with a soft amber glow. Outside, the bare trees lining the half-mile driveway stood still against the winter sky, their branches no longer rattling in the wind. Inside, the mansion felt less like a structure of glass and steel and more like a home holding its first steady heartbeat in months. Richard sat in silence, his elbows resting on his knees, watching his son lean against a woman who had no contract promising loyalty and no obligation beyond her hourly wage. He thought about the 5 previous hires, about the interviews conducted in polished conference rooms, about the checks written without hesitation. He had approached his son's grief the same way he approached failing stocks or stalled negotiations, by applying pressure and expecting results. Yet this quiet connection had formed without force, without strategy. Lucas shifted slightly and rested his head against Naomi's shoulder once more, not in desperation this time, but in comfort. His breathing was even now, slow and deep, the tension that once tightened his small frame easing inch by inch. Naomi finally lifted one hand and gently placed it against his back, not restraining him, simply acknowledging his trust. The gesture was subtle, protective without being possessive. Richard stood slowly, the sound of his shoes against the floor softer than usual. He approached carefully, as though afraid a single abrupt movement might shatter what had been built. "Lucas," he said quietly. The boy looked up, eyes clear but no longer guarded. For the first time in a year, there was no resistance in that gaze. Only exhaustion and something close to relief. Richard swallowed the familiar instinct to instruct, to correct, to take control. Instead, he lowered himself to the floor across from them, mirroring the posture he had seen moments earlier. The tailored suit against cold marble felt unfamiliar, but he did not move away. "I am here," he said, the words simple, almost fragile. Lucas studied him carefully, measuring sincerity. Naomi did not intervene. This was not her moment to guide. It was his. The distance between father and son, once measured in silence and frustration, seemed smaller now, not erased, but softened. Lucas hesitated, then slowly reached one hand toward his father. The gesture was not dramatic. It was small and uncertain, but it was offered. Richard accepted it without tightening his grip, without overwhelming the moment. The 3 of them remained there as evening approached, the mansion lights gradually turning on one by one as daylight faded beyond the tall windows. No one spoke for several minutes. No one needed to. The house that once echoed with tension now held a different kind of stillness, the kind that does not signal emptiness, but healing. Evening settled fully over the estate, and the mansion lights glowed against the darkening sky, like something finally awake instead of hollow. Lucas remained seated on the marble floor between Naomi and his father, his small hand still loosely wrapped around Richard's fingers. The connection was not tight, not desperate, just present. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The silence no longer felt fragile. It felt earned. Richard studied his son's face in the softer light, noticing details he had overlooked for months, the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the way his lower lip trembled when he was trying to hold something in. He realized that every outburst, every rejection of the nannies, had been a test. Not a rejection of people, but a rejection of anyone who might disappear again. Naomi shifted slightly, easing her posture but not breaking the circle. She understood the weight of absence. She had carried it herself, in hospital corridors measured in feet and days that stretched like years. She had learned that grief does not shout forever. Eventually it withdraws and waits to see who will sit beside it. Lucas glanced up at her once more, then at his father. The look was different now. It was a question. Richard felt it immediately. He inhaled slowly, letting go of the instinct to promise solutions. "I am not leaving," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they held more honesty than any contract he had ever signed. Lucas studied him carefully, measuring tone, posture, breath. Then he did something he had not done since the night everything changed. He leaned toward his father as well. Not fully, not dramatically, just enough that their shoulders brushed. Richard closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed not by chaos, but by the absence of it. Naomi watched the shift with calm understanding. This was not her victory. It was a bridge. She began to rise slowly from the floor, careful not to disrupt the closeness forming between father and son. Lucas's hand instinctively reached toward her again, fear flickering for a second. She paused and met his eyes. "I am not disappearing," she said gently. "I will be here tomorrow." The reassurance landed softly. Lucas nodded once, small but certain. Richard stood as well, offering his son a hand. This time Lucas accepted it without hesitation. They moved together toward the wide windows overlooking the long driveway, where night had settled in quiet layers. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress protecting grief. It felt like a place learning how to hold it. Naomi stepped back, giving them space, but she did not retreat. She remained present, steady, and grounded. And in that stillness, Richard finally understood that the strength he had been searching for was never found in control. It was found in the courage to stay when staying felt uncertain. Night deepened around the estate, and the long driveway lights flickered on in quiet sequence, one after another, stretching like a soft runway into the dark. Inside, the breakfast room no longer felt like a battlefield of broken routines. It felt lived in. Lucas stood between his father and Naomi, small hands tucked into the sleeves of his sweater, eyes calmer than they had been in months. The tension that, once coiled through his shoulders, had loosened into something fragile but real. Richard guided him gently toward the staircase, not with urgency, not with command, but with presence. Each step echoed lightly against the wide marble hall, no longer sharp, no longer cold. Naomi followed at a respectful distance, giving father and son space while remaining close enough to reassure. Upstairs, Lucas paused outside his bedroom door, glancing back once, as if testing whether the quiet would hold. Richard noticed the hesitation and knelt to his level again. "We will figure this out together," he said softly. Lucas searched his face for certainty. He found it. The door opened slowly, revealing a room frozen in time, toys arranged carefully, a lamp casting a steady glow beside the bed. For months, this space had been a place of restless nights and unanswered questions. Tonight felt different. Lucas stepped inside without resistance. He walked to the bed and sat down, looking from his father to Naomi. The unspoken question lingered in his eyes. Naomi nodded gently. "I will be here in the morning," she assured him again, steady and calm. That promise carried more weight than any formal contract. Richard pulled the blanket over his son's shoulders and sat beside him, something he had not done consistently since grief reshaped their lives. Lucas did not push him away. He did not retreat. Instead, he leaned slightly into his father's side, breathing even and slow. Naomi remained near the doorway, watching without intrusion, understanding that healing does not need an audience. The house felt warmer now, the air lighter, as if the walls themselves had released months of held breath. Richard looked toward Naomi, gratitude unspoken but unmistakable. She did not respond with triumph. She responded with quiet humility. This was not about replacing what was lost. It was about staying present for what remained. As the bedside lamp dimmed and Lucas's eyes finally closed without tension, the mansion that once echoed with frustration settled into genuine stillness. Outside, the winter sky cleared fully, revealing a sweep of stars above the wide Connecticut horizon. Inside, for the first time in a long time, peace did not feel temporary. It felt possible. Morning arrived quietly over the estate, pale sunlight spilling across the long driveway and brushing against the tall windows like a careful hand. Inside, the house did not wake to tension or hurried footsteps. It woke to stillness. Richard had remained in the armchair beside Lucas's bed through the night, not out of obligation, but because leaving had no longer felt right. When the first rays of light filtered through the curtains, Lucas stirred gently, blinking against the brightness. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face, the old fear that he might be alone. Then he saw his father still there, jacket folded neatly over the back of the chair, eyes tired but present. The panic never came. He sat up slowly, the blanket sliding down to his lap, and glanced toward the doorway. Naomi stood there already, quiet as morning itself, having arrived before sunrise. She did not speak immediately. She did not step forward to claim the moment. She simply nodded once, steady and reassuring. Lucas offered the smallest smile, fragile but real. Downstairs, the staff moved carefully, aware that something had shifted overnight. The marble floors no longer echoed with urgency. The air felt warmer, lighter. Richard rose from the chair and crossed the room slowly, kneeling beside his son once more. "We will take this one day at a time," he said softly. Lucas did not argue. He did not turn away. Instead, he reached for his father's hand without hesitation. Naomi stepped back to allow them space, her presence no longer the center, but the foundation that had allowed the center to rebuild. As they descended the wide staircase together, sunlight streamed across the walls, illuminating family photographs that had gathered dust in recent months. Richard paused briefly at one frame, then looked toward Naomi with quiet understanding. He realized that strength was never about commanding a room or controlling a situation. It was about staying when it would be easier to retreat. Lucas walked ahead of them into the breakfast room, no longer bracing himself for conflict. He climbed onto his chair without protest and rested his hands on the table. Richard took the seat beside him. Naomi moved toward the kitchen to prepare the morning, not as an outsider, but as someone trusted. Outside, the Connecticut sky stretched wide and clear, the winter air crisp but no longer harsh. Inside, the mansion that once felt empty now held something steady and growing. No speeches were made. No dramatic declarations followed. There was only the quiet rhythm of a family learning to breathe again. And, in that silence, without applause or spectacle, healing began to take root, not because someone forced it, but because someone chose to stay.